Psalm 29 is a very unique psalm. There's really none quite like it. It is classified as a creation hymn because it deals with one of the four realms of creation in the Psalms. There's the water, earth, and the sky, and humanity. This one deals with water, specifically with thunderstorm. And of course, we know today that thunderstorms are critical in the recycling of water on the planet. As rain falls, it washes down and eventually reaches the sea where it becomes useless for drinking, and it is needs to be desalinated. And we have this process of evaporation then that allows that water to be purified and then transported back over the land to return again as rain. It's really quite remarkable, the water cycle that makes life possible on this planet. Now, David probably didn't understand all of that stuff, but it is significant that he notes that God is the one who is ultimately in control of the weather. And so that's what this psalm is about, the weather, the interplay between the waters below and the waters above, between the oceans and the sky, and the rain that results from that. It's a psalm that's very similar to Canaanite hymns, and some would say that David copied that or borrowed this from a Canaanite hymn, and I suppose if that's the case, it really doesn't bother me because we still do that today. If there is a popular art form or song, I don't think it's wrong to borrow that art form and redeem it with lyrics that speak the truth. It's true that in the ancient world, the worship of deities that had to do with the weather was a pretty big deal because weather was necessary for life. You had to have rain, and so you would pray to the gods or the god of the storm or the rain to make sure that your crops would be sufficiently watered. So it's a pretty important deity, and this psalm makes it clear that Yahweh is the one that we need to pray to because he is the God of the storm. One thing you note about this psalm is that the reference to the name of the Lord is frequent. It found the name of Yahweh occurs 18 times in just 11 verses of this song. It's quite rhythmic, in fact, as you read it because of that, because of the repetition that's involved. The structure of the psalm reveals that there is a call to worship. Then there's a center portion that is the voice of the Lord speaking in the storm. And then the final verses conclude the frame of this psalm with the vision of Yahweh sitting enthroned over the flood. The word voice will occur 7 times in the center of this psalm, center being 7 being a number of completeness. Now taking a look sort of line by line here. The first line, ascribe to the Lord, O heavenly beings. This is the Hebrew words B'nai Elohim, or sons of God, sons of the Almighty. Elohim is a typical name for God, and in this case, it's one of the examples where this word means an angel. It's likely that these are referring to the throne angels, angels that worshiped God, were present in his heavenly throne room day and night, and never ceasing to their praise. So this would be the highest level of angels that are asked to praise him and to ascribe to him glory and strength, glory that is due his name. The word glory is the Hebrew word kabod, which means weight or heaviness or splendor. And so we're asking God to be worshiped in that regard. And in the splendor of holiness, that's the literal translation there. And the question is, are we talking about our holiness or God's holiness? And I think in context it's pretty clear that this is God's holiness. Now, there are some would translate this holy attire as a reference to the priests. And in fact, I've even heard this used to justify dressing up to go to church these days, to wear our holy attire, to dress appropriately, dress in a nice way. I don't think that's what this is talking about. I think this is God's holiness. In fact, the NIV translates this, the splendor of his holiness. It's probably the best way to view that. Poetically speaking, the first couple lines give us an example of stair-like parallelism, and that's where you have a series of elements that build to a climax. Each line adds something to the next until it is rather climactic. And so here you have this 3, ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to the Lord, ascribe to the Lord, worship the Lord. So it builds to a climax, something like perhaps even the building of a storm. Now for the midsection of the song, you can take a look and see that we have in verses 3 and 9, we have 3 lines. The other verses have 2 or 1 here. So there's something about the beginning and end of this section that set it off as a frame. So we're going to consider that this is the frame of the psalm and then look at the interior of it. Now, to understand the psalm, I think you need to be aware of the topography of Israel. So I've got a map here that shows this. Here's Jerusalem, located right there in the center. David, the city of David. And what we have to the west, of course, is the Mediterranean Sea. And we have a coastal plain, some hill country here, and then some mountains. And by mountains, we're talking about 3,000 foot elevation. And then on the other side of this, there's a rather sudden drop to an area below the sea level. The Dead Sea is located about 1,400 feet below sea level. It's the lowest place on earth. And every place you see in gray here, continuing up to the Sea of Galilee, is below sea level, including the Sea of Galilee, about 700 feet below sea level. And so you're talking about a differential of 3,000 feet above sea level, 1,400 feet below sea level. That's quite a big differential to create some dramatic weather. So you have the moisture provided over the Mediterranean, coming over the land, condensing as rain and rather dramatic storms. So the topography is set up for thunderstorms. To the north, we have the mountains of Lebanon. This is a picture of Mount Hermon, or as this psalm references it, Mount Sirion. And as you can see, snow-covered, and these mountains were the source of the headwaters of the Jordan, ultimately, that watered the whole land of Israel. So a very important mountain range that would have been like our national parks in the U.S. Cedars, pine trees, all those things, mountain wildlife would have been present there, very, very lush. And then to the south, you have quite the opposite extreme. You have the Negev Desert, or as the psalm references it, the desert of Kadesh, or the desert of holiness. So to the south, barren, dry, hot, so extremes. So with that in mind, let's take a look again at the psalm and look particularly at this midsection as we see this storm building. In fact, the storm itself is built using the stair-like parallelism. For the voice of the Lord is over the waters, and I'm assuming this to be the Mediterranean, the ocean. To the west, the God of glory thunders. The Lord is over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. It's full of majesty. And so we imagine this massive thunderhead forming over the ocean to the west. And then we look to the north, and the voice of the Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon to skip like a calf. So this is a reference to the mountains. Lebanon equal mountains. So mountains are skipping. We see the same kind of language in Psalm 114. Syrian like a young wild ox, and Syrian is another name for Mount Hermon, that snow-covered mountain I showed you a picture of. And then to the south, the voice of the Lord flashes forth flames of fire. So this is lightning. He shakes the wilderness. The Lord shakes the wilderness of Kadesh, or holy. So north and south, the storm is breaking out across the land. In verse 9, the voice of the Lord makes the deer give birth. And this is suggested here that what's happening is the trauma of the storm is forcing animals to go into premature labor. Trauma can do that. So that's a possibility. There's also another option up here in the footnote. You see revocalization makes the oaks to shake. So Hebrew does not have vowels. And if you change the vowels, you can get different words. Normally you can tell that from the context, but here's a case where the context allows for both options. What you can see is that the storm builds in the west. Then we have images from the north of a storm shaking the mountains, lightning, and shaking the desert then in the south. So in every area of the land, the storm is having its impact. And then we come full circle in verse 9 as the temple inhabitants all cry glory. So up in verses 1 and 2, we've invited the temple inhabitants, these heavenly beings, to declare the glory and strength of God. And now, in fact, verse 9, they do declare his glory. Verse 10, the Lord sits enthroned over the flood. Again, the Hebrew here is ambiguous. It could be sit or it could be sat. I tend to think it's sits because the context is all kind of present tense. We're describing a storm, and now we come to this vision of the Lord sitting enthroned, presiding over the flood. However, some interpret this as sat. In that case, we may be referring to a couple of different floods. We might be referring to the original flood. As God created the heavens and the earth, the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And so from the very beginning, Genesis 1, the Lord sat enthroned over the flood. Or move a few chapters further in the book of Genesis, and you have another flood that covered the earth, the flood during the days of Noah. In either case, it's clear the point is that Yahweh is king over the flood, over the storm. What I love about this psalm is in verse 11, we take all the strength and power of the storm that God wields, and then it says at verse 11 that the Lord gives strength to his people. We've just gotten a beautiful picture of the incredible strength of God, and every time we witness a thunderstorm, we're aware of the strength of God. The good news is that God shares that strength with him. The same power of the storm he gives to us. He shares with us. Reminder of our previous psalm, the Lord is the strength of his people. He is the saving refuge of his. May the Lord bless his people with peace. The psalm concludes with a prayer for the community. And I love the fact that the final word of this very noisy psalm is the word shalom. That is